game. This plays 1 to 4 players cooperatively, and the most minimal version of the game is going to be offering up a 20-hour replayable campaign. And this one is my own personal pick of the week, and I admit it, it's mostly for the IP, but I do think there's a lot of really interesting decisions here as well, and I really do like how they are taking on the IP and trying to stay as true to it as possible. And the first example of how they're doing that I'm a huge fan of is the way that they're translating the world of Elden Ring into a tabletop game. Even if you're only slightly familiar with Elden Ring, you can probably guess that it boasts quite a massive map with quite a lot to discover. And translating that entire map into a board game while trying to keep all those POIs would obviously create quite a lot of bloat and probably wouldn't be feasible for a board game. So the way that they're doing that is, rather than watering down the world, they're just going to be focusing on specific regions and trying to stay as true to those regions as possible. So this means that you can't explore all the areas of the map, but the areas that you can will maintain a much truer feel to the original game and the original world. And of course, this does leave a lot of room for expansions in the future, and you can probably expect at least 2 more campaigns down the line. And something I really like about this campaign is that even for this first one, there's going to be a few different options depending on how much content you want to sign up for. And the most minimal version of the game that you can pledge for is the entry-level pledge, which is going to provide a 20+ hour replayable campaign, which is going to introduce all the core elements of the game, like character customization, side quests, and narrative that changes based on the player's decisions. But this version of the game will also just come with a single dungeon and just a single final boss. So this is going to have you starting in the Weeping Peninsula, then you're going to be battling your way through Castle Morn until you get to the final boss, and once you defeat the final boss, you essentially win that campaign. And for most of us, these big narrative campaigns don't really ever get completely finished, so I think this is a great option for anyone that thinks they can sink about 20 hours into the game, or if you just want to get a smaller version to try the game first and see if you like it before you dive into more content, because there is more content. The core pledge is going to be adding another 30 to 40 hours to your campaign, adding a whole bunch of different dungeons, side quests, and bosses into that initial experience. And of course, it's going to be expanding the map, allowing players to explore the regions of the Grafted King. And in addition to that world building, another thing that is a huge aspect of Elden Ring is the variety of bosses. And I think this pledge is really going to give you that, bringing a lot more variety that just isn't offered in that entry pledge. So if you don't want to miss out on that element of the game and you really want to translate that into the board game experience, I think the core pledge is probably what you're looking for. And of course, if you really want to get crazy, there is the all-in pledge, and this is going to be adding more dungeons, more bosses, and just a lot more content and areas for players to explore. Of course, it's going to be adding a lot more hours to the campaign, and all this is going to be added through the Stormville Castle expansion, as well as 2 Kickstarter exclusive expansions, which are the Erd Tree Avatar and the Flying Dragon Agheel expansions. And I don't have a clue what any of those are, but if you've played the game, those probably sound familiar. And as I said, there will be more campaigns for this in the future, and I'm 99% sure that anything that's exclusive in this campaign will be offered in those future campaigns. So if you feel like you might be missing out and you really want to get this now, I think there's a pretty good chance that you're okay to get one of the smaller pledges, and then if you really like the game, you can always back it for more in the future in one of those future campaigns. So with all that said, whatever you spend here is 100% not my fault. But the way that this game works is that players are going to be starting out on a particular tile, and players are going to be building up the map as they play the game. Players are going to be taking turns drawing tiles and putting them out on the map as they explore. Depending on the region you're in, that's going to dictate which subset of tiles you have access to, but you're just going to be drawing these randomly, so the map can form a little bit differently from game to game, adding a bit of variety even if you play the same campaign a second time. And each of these tiles can offer all sorts of options to the players, such as collecting different resources or materials, or interacting with NPCs in order to gain clues on how to move forward, or to trade, sell, or buy gear to level up your character. And for those of you that are familiar with Elden Ring, you're probably wondering how they incorporated 2 of the most important points of interest in the game, which are the Sites of Grace and the Stakes of Marika. And the Sites of Grace are going to be working exactly like they do in the video game, where they're going to be refreshing your health and your flasks, but they're also going to be resetting all the enemies out in the overworld. The Stakes of Marika are going to work a little bit differently, because rather than acting as spawn points, which could be a little bit fiddly for a board game, constantly being spawned back at a certain location every time you die, instead what they're going to do is give you some extra lives anytime that you go up against a boss. And I do think this is a good change. Not only does it allow the board game to feel a little bit different than the video game, but I think it'll streamline your gameplay quite a lot, which is really important, especially for these really large campaigns. But of course, the world of Elden Ring isn't all about the sights, and some of these tiles will be protected by different enemies, and you will have to fight against those enemies before you're able to explore what the tile has to offer. And the combat in this game is one of the reasons I made it my pick of the week. I think it's offering something unique that I haven't really seen before, and it's a little bit more advanced than just rolling dice. But before I get into that, I do just want to mention how the story is going to be unfolding and how players are going to be guided through that overarching campaign. And the way that this is done is through the guidance of Grace deck, and this is going to provide a whole bunch of different cards that players are going to be going through sequentially. Some of the cards can be standalone with a few different options of how to fulfill it, while other cards can chain off of each other, creating different paths or evolving and progressing over time as you move through them. So you can think of this deck as your main quest being revealed to you little by little in sequential order, depending on the decisions that you make, and then all the side quests are going to be offered up through different areas on the board on those different tiles as you interact with different NPCs and explore these different regions. And another huge element to Elden Ring is the character creation and the amount of flexibility that the game offers you when it comes to deciding what kind of weapons you want your character to use and what kind of skills that they have as they develop throughout the game. And this board game will be offering you that same level of flexibility, but this is all going to be done through deck building. Each player is going to be able to build their own dedicated attack deck based on their crafted consumables, as well as any weapons and equipment they're able to find. And of course, they will be able to assign different Ashes of War to their weapons, which essentially grants them with a special attack. But this is just one layer of your attack deck, because you're also going to be combining that with the deck of your character, which you're going to be customizing by leveling up and increasing different stats. And when you enter combat at the start of each round, you're going to be taking all the enemy cards as well as your own initiative cards, and you're going to be shuffling them together and creating a river. And the order of that river is going to dictate when you, your allies, or the enemies get to attack. The enemy card's going to have a few different options for the enemies to attack you, but when it's a player's turn, you're going to have 3 actions each, and you're going to be using those actions to do different things like attack, move, or change battle stances, or you can even use your actions to draw up additional cards. And players are always limited to 3 actions no matter how much they level up their character, but you can level up your hand size, giving you a lot more options and flexibility, which actually makes you quite a bit more powerful in battle. And this brings me to the aspect of battle that I think is the most interesting and unique, and one of the reasons that this is my pick of the week, and that's because battle doesn't take place on a specific map or board. Instead, every player has their own ring-bound quest book, and whenever you get into a battle with an enemy, you're going to be getting your own personal book and then using that to fight the enemies. This means that if a single player gets into a battle, they can just resolve that battle on their own in their quest book, while the other players are still exploring the board and taking their actions at the same time. But another really cool thing about this is that if multiple players are involved in the same battle, say in a boss battle, you're actually going to be sliding your quest books together to make a larger battlefield. And the way that these quest books work is that there's going to be a whole bunch of different pages depending on the location and the enemies you're going up against, and you're going to be turning to the appropriate page. And this will always present the players with a specific battle grid, but there can also be some additional rules, rewards, or objectives that the players might want to be aware of. And the way that these grids work is that the enemies are going to be moving around on the top portion of the grid, and then the players are going to be moving around on the bottom. And each row on the grid doesn't represent your relative location, instead it represents your current stance. And since there's 3 different rows on a player's side, that means that there's 3 different stances that players can be in. The topmost row is the most aggressive stance, which allows you to do bigger hits and bigger damage, whereas the bottom row is your more defensive stance, which is going to allow you to gain another card into your hand at the end of each turn. And then there's the neutral stance in the middle row, which is going to give you more control over your initiative order, because you'll be able to put your card anywhere that you want in that initiative river. And all of this works similar to the enemies as well, where they can behave a little bit differently depending on which row they're in, but there are certain spots on the enemy side of the grid that can open them up to different attacks and critical hits. So that means that if the players are able to get them into those spaces and then also get into an aggressive stance, then you can really nail them with a powerful hit. And this is where it really matters which column you and your enemies are located out on the grid, because that's going to represent the spatial element of the battle and where you are relative to all the different enemies and whether or not you or your enemies are in range. And of course, you'll have this board full of a whole bunch of different miniatures to represent your characters as well as the different enemies, and this is another reason that I'm looking forward to this campaign so much. I don't really base a game on its miniatures, but one thing Elden Ring is known for is its crazy designs and its really intricate and elaborate monsters, and I'm just really excited to see those on the tabletop. And if this one sounds interesting to you, or if you just want to check out what those miniatures look like, I have links to this campaign in the description below, and if it hasn't launched yet, you can click that link to get notified.